Is red meat bad for you? I started thinking about this after I saw this Guardian article called Red Unprocessed Meat Can Shorten Life, Say Scientists. So I had a read through the article, and there does seem to be a correlation between increased red and processed meat consumption and early death. However, it is only an observational study, so a direct cause is not proven, but there does seem to be some kind of a link there. However, don't replace red meat with junk food. Instead, it seems that it's best to go towards more of a Mediterranean-style diet of vegetables, nuts, whole grains, some fish and poultry. But I wanted to take a look at the study that's linked to in the Guardian article, and it's this one from the BMJ called Association of Changes in Red Meat Consumption with Total Cause Specific Mortality Among US Women and Men, 2 prospective cohort studies. Go on, that's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Anyway, it shows that increases in red meat consumption, especially processed meat, were associated with a higher risk of death. Decreases in red meat consumption and simultaneous increases in healthy alternative food choices over time were associated with a lower risk of mortality. Further evidence supports the health benefits of replacing red and processed meat consumption with healthy protein sources, whole grains or vegetables. But what do other studies say? There's this one on PubMed called Processed and Unprocessed Red Meat and Risk of Colorectal Cancer, Analysis by Tumor Location and Modification by Time. And this is from 2015. And it says, in conclusion, in these 2 large cohorts of US health professionals, we found little evidence that higher intake of unprocessed red meat substantially increased risk of CRC. On the other hand, we observed a significant and positive association between processed red meat and CRC, particularly distal colon cancer. Recent processed meat intake was not associated with risk of distal colon cancer. Further studies, particularly those with sufficient sample size to examine associations separately by subsites across the colon, are needed to confirm these findings and elucidate potentially distinct pathways underlying the relationship between processed meat and subtypes of unprocessed red meat and CRC. Whoa, that was a difficult paragraph to read. So it's obviously not been written in order to be read out in a video like this. So looking at another study, Red Meat and Colorectal Cancer, a quantitative update on the state of the epidemiologic science, and this is also from 2015. And this says, the state of the epidemiologic science on red meat consumption and CRC is best described in terms of weak associations, heterogeneity, and ability to disentangle effects from other dietary and lifestyle factors, lack of a clear dose-response effect, and weakening evidence over time. And it also says, in conclusion, based on the quantitative findings and scientific rationale for interpretation documented in the current meta-analysis, red meat intake does not appear to be an independent predictor of CRC risk. And then there's this study from 2016 called Human Risk of Diseases Associated with Red Meat Intake, Analysis of Current Theories and Proposed Role for Metabolic Incorporation of a Non-Human Sialic Acid. This study seems to be rather inconclusive. It says that more research needs to be done. And to quote, overall we conclude that while multiple mechanisms are likely operative, many proposed theories to date are not specific for red meat and that the viral and xenoautoantigen theories deserve further consideration. And here's another study, also from 2016, called Total Red Meat Intake of greater than or equal to 0.5 servings per day does not negatively influence cardiovascular disease risk factors. A systematically researched meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And this one also seems to be inconclusive. And I quote, in conclusion, the results from this systematically searched meta-analysis of RCTs support that the consumption of greater than or equal to 0.5 compared with less than 0.5 servings of total red meat per day does not influence blood lipids, lipoproteins and or blood pressures which are clinically relevant CVD risk factors. These results are generalizable across a variety of populations, dietary patterns and types of red meat. These results are inconsistent with much of the observational evidence related to red meat consumption and CVD, which prompts the need for future research to reconcile the apparent disconnect between RCT and observational-based conclusions. These paragraphs really are not meant to be read out loud. It's ridiculous. But anyway, what about more recent studies? Well, here's one from 2018 called Long-Term Unprocessed and Processed Red Meat Consumption and Risk of Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease, a prospective cohort study of women. And to quote, it says, "In this prospective cohort of women with moderate red meat consumption, long-term processed red meat consumption was associated with an increased risk of COPD, particularly among ex-smokers." And then here's one from 2019 called Red Meat, Processed Meat and Other Dietary Protein Sources and Risk of Overall and Cause-Specific Mortality in the Netherlands Cohort Study. So it seems to be that it's not red meat that's specifically the problem, it's processed meat. And to quote, "In conclusion, this large prospective study suggests that while red meat intake unprocessed is not related to increased mortality, processed meat consumption is related to an increased risk of overall CVD and respiratory mortality, potentially due to nitrite. Substituting red meat and other protein sources may lower mortality risk. The findings provide support for public health recommendations to minimise processed meat intake." And finally, there's this study also from 2019 called Effect of Red, Processed and White Meat Consumption on the Risk of Gastric Cancer, an Overall and Dose-Response Meta-Analysis. And to quote, "In conclusion, the increased consumption of red and processed meat is positively related to the risk of gastric cancer. On the other hand, white meat intake seems to have a negative association with the risk of gastric cancer." So, to summarise, it's best to reduce your intake of red meat. Instead, eat white meat, fish, nuts, whole grains and vegetables. If you do really want to eat red meat, make sure it's unprocessed. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, please like and possibly subscribe too. Until next time, I wish you the very best of health.